Now, I want to set us up with this. Active listening. If any of you ever sat with somebody, you don't need to raise your hand, just think, somebody who is hurting, who is having a hard time, sat with them, whatever that may mean, literally sitting next to them, whether you're on the phone with them, just being with them. Ever thought about what you're doing those times? Have you ever just been without words? You're just like, I don't know what to say to this person, whatever heartache and thing that they are dealing with. So the idea of active listening is this. This is something that all relationships, not just when somebody's hurting, but it's very helpful in a situation when somebody's hurting. All relationships that are working well have some form of active listening in them. And so this calls it 7 steps to active listening. This is just to get us to think about it, because this is not just, we all know the difference between somebody hearing you and actually listening to you. Because I'm sure you've also been in the situation where, this is my favorite one, and whenever I think about hearing versus listening. I was in high school, and a friend of mine, for whatever reason, her attention was always somewhere else when we were in the cafeteria. And I would come up to the table, this happened more than once, I would come up to the table and I would say, hey, how's it going, blah, blah, I'd sit down, sit with the friends. And I could just tell she was not listening to me. And how did I know she wasn't listening to me? Because she's like, yeah, so how's the day, what's happening? Like she's trying to catch, I don't know, the guys, the other friends. Oh, hey, someone's over there. And I could say the most random thing. Hey, you know what? The sky is very green today. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's great. Was she really listening to me? No. She wasn't hardly looking at me, not the entire time, but many times. And I was like, I don't think she's even listening to me. I definitely didn't feel like she was listening. She may have heard me. She may have repeated back to me, yeah, the sky is green, but she wasn't listening. So it's a very important thing to have. You all know the difference between that. So here's just some tips when you're thinking about what is active listening. Obviously, the first one is to be attentive. Actually paying attention to the person that you're talking with. Asking open-ended questions is really great instead of just asking yes or no. And you can hopefully get, and you guys know the difference between that. Open-ended means asking something that somebody can give you a fuller answer to and not just say something like, oh, well, do you like dogs? Yes or no? That doesn't really open the conversation, but you could say something like, since we were talking about dogs, what kinds of dogs do you like? You can get a better answer there. Request clarification. It lets somebody know that you're listening to them when you say, so when you're talking about, I'll use my example, the sky is green. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because not quite, maybe I'm not seeing green sky, but what are you talking about? Paraphrasing. Okay, so you're saying the sky is a different color. Okay. Summarizing. You could just come back and summarize in one sentence. Okay, the sky is green. Showing empathy, especially if somebody is having a rough time, like, oh, that sounds really tough. Or maybe you're doing it non-verbally. Maybe you're just, sitting there with them. Maybe you're holding a hand. Maybe you're holding them. And using open body language. Again, my friend who's like looking around my head, what kind of body language is she giving me? That's not... it's not to say closed body language, but it's not body language that's telling me that she's paying attention to what I'm saying to her. So attentive listening is a huge, or active listening is a huge thing for all of us. And this comes to play here in the story of Job as I got to thinking about it. So let's set the stage. You all know the story of Job, I'm sure. And maybe you haven't seen it in a while. But in Job chapter 1, we get this. We get that Job is a God-fearing man. First off, it says, in the land of Uz, there lived a man, this is Job 1:1, whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Like right off the bat, we're told Job is a righteous man. We don't have to guess about his character. We're just told. Okay. And not only that, but what? He has 7 sons, 3 daughters, and he owns lots of herds. He's got camels, he's got oxen, 500, 7,000 of one, 3,000 of something else, of the camels, 500 donkeys, a large number of servants. And it says he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. So this is also very important man, a God-fearing man, and he owns a lot of stuff. He would be rich by their standards. But we're not left with that. And it tells us that his sons would take turns holding these different feasts. And verse 5 says, when a period of feasting had come to its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And this was Job's regular custom. So Job looks pretty good. right? He looks pretty good on paper. And we see even in God's eyes, God gives us the character of this man. He's a righteous man. He's even doing intercessory for his family. Perhaps during this time that they've had this feast, perhaps they have sinned in their hearts, and he goes and intercedes for them. This looks great so far. But we've only gone 5 verses, and this is all about to change. Because I'm betting when you think of the book of Job, you don't tend to think of this first section right away. You think of the stuff that's coming up here, and that is this. Because behind the scenes, we're told, this is in verse 6, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? And Satan answered the Lord, from roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it. And then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless, upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. So in case we weren't sure at the beginning where it tells us that that's the character of Job, God reiterates that when Satan comes. And Satan is an accuser. I mean, this is exactly what his name means. When he comes before God, he is bringing an accusation. And I'm going to paraphrase because you guys know this part. The way this is bringing. So he brings accusations and God sets limits. And this happens twice. And at one point, at verse 9, where he first brings this, well, doesn't Job just fear you? Does Job fear you for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household? Basically, you've just blessed him with all this different stuff, so of course he's going to serve you. Like, nothing's happened to him. And God basically says, okay, do what you're going to do, but don't harm the man himself. Now, talking about character, this is where people get really kind of stuck. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this question, but it is a question that people have. And I would encourage us, if you're like questioning like the origins of evil and how does God allow bad things to happen, that's not exactly what we're going to be talking about today. There is some great materials out there on this, particularly David Ashrick. If you look him up under Arise, has some great stuff like that goes into details about God allowing. Because a lot of people get stuck here and they go, well, basically, God, this is what they think. Basically, God did this to Job because he let Satan do it. But remember here that God is the one that's setting limits and that God is not the one bringing the accusations. So Satan goes out and does what? If you're not sure about Satan's character, what does he do? I mean, the Bible is absolutely right when it says the thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Satan's not out to be like, yeah, let's make Job richer and happier and da-da-da-da, or any of those things, right? It says, starting in verse 13 and onward, when Job's sons and daughters are at this feast, the entire house collapses on them. He loses all his children. And then right behind that, he loses all his servants. And then he loses all his herds. I mean, all this is back to back to back to back, just pummeled down. So if you're uncertain about the character of what Satan's about, this first part should let you know Satan is not about any good. Certainly not about any good. Because he immediately goes out to destroy and kill. And he does that. And you can just imagine, don't imagine too hard because it would make you very depressed, but you can imagine, because I know you guys know people or maybe have been through your own experiences where it just seems non-stop. Just thing after thing after thing is happening. I'm always amazed. You all know the work that I do, the stories that I hear from people, the lives that people have lived. They go, it's just been nonstop. This has happened, that has happened, that has happened, that has happened, da, 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 da. And I think, yeah, you're in good company. You know, Job was there with you. Now, it doesn't stop there, though, right? Satan's not satisfied with that because Job doesn't turn around and curse God and doesn't say, well, fine, God, I want nothing to do with you because you're not blessing me anymore. None of this happens. So he comes back and he's like, all right, we're making another deal if you want, not necessarily. But God's like, look, he's not, not cursing me. And Satan goes, well, of course not. Again, I'm paraphrasing. Because you have not let me touch him. He's physically healthy. And if you think about that, those of us, you all heard my rough voice. I was sick the other week. Little side note, little cocky because I hadn't been sick I'm not joking, for years. I hadn't had a cold. And I was like, I'm never going to have a cold again. I knew that wasn't practical, but it had been many years. But once you're sick, and it's just a cold, but once you're sick, you remember, it doesn't matter what else you have, you're just miserable. And I was like, yeah, I mean, Job lost all these other things, but he still got his health at this point. And health is a big deal. And We all know that when you're not feeling physically healthy, it kind of sort of doesn't matter what's around you. Yes, you want to be comfortable. You kind of are like, I don't even care what's happening. I just want to live through this, whatever it is. So at this point, Job's health is not being affected, but Satan comes back and says, well, let me least monkey with his health here. Like that will knock him down. And once again, God says, okay, but here's some limits. You can't kill him. As some people say, there's some things worse than death, and this might be it. And I'm somewhat joking, but at the same time, right? Satan goes right in there and does what? Takes away his health, causes these boils. It's painful, and all of this, and even his wife, who we like to sometimes be like, oh, she's not helpful. She says, why are you going to keep holding on to your integrity and just curse God and die? You have to remember too that this didn't just happen to Job. This happened to her too. They're together. It's their children that died. It's their herds. I mean, I know this is a patriarchal society, but she is affected by this as well. So her saying that, we try to be like, oh my gosh, she's not supporting him. Imagine your loved one. Once again, don't imagine too hard suffering. It's not fun to watch somebody that you care about suffer. So of course she's probably just like, I can't watch you suffer. I can't bear this. I mean, I don't blame her in that respect when I see this. Now, keep in mind here, though, that we know, because we've been told what's happening behind the scenes. Job and his wife have no idea that this is what is going on. But then what is interesting to me is that immediately behind this, as all of this is stripped away and his health is taken away, God is silent for 35 chapters. We do not hear from him for 35 chapters. Can any of you relate to this, where you feel like maybe you're kind of like understanding what God wants for you, and then you're just like, where, God, what's happening? What? Nothing. I'm not getting anything. Maybe I'm reading, and I don't seem to be getting anything on the reading. My prayers are bouncing off the ceilings. And this is what's happened to Job. In the meantime, in the absence of God, we see these three friends. And it gives us these three friends' names: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And actually there's a fourth friend we'll talk about later, who come to sit with him. And initially they do pretty good. It says they had set out from their homes, this is midway through verse 11, and met together by agreement and sympathized with him and comforted him. And when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. And then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Now, if we had stopped there, this might have been the best part if we had just stopped there, right? They start out so well. They come together. We're going to comfort our friend. We're going to sympathize with our friend. They get there, and this tells you how bad he is. They hardly even recognize him. They're like, is this you? And they sit with him for how many days? 7 days. They don't say anything. They just sit with him. Now, in hindsight, I'm sure that Job probably thought these were the best of the days with these friends, because what comes out of their mouth next, spoiler alert, isn't going to be very helpful. So for 7 days, they're sat with him. They're doing really well. They're doing actually what we're seeing with the active listening. They're just sitting there being with him. It's great. And Job does, talk a little bit here. And he's talking about all his woes and stuff. But then we see in verse 4, the first friend, Eliphaz, says to him, basically, I'm not going to read through all these, I'm going to summarize these. Well, Job, you must have some hidden sin. Oh, okay. So the friend finally opens his mouth, and he's been sitting there listening to him, hearing Job. Job's been saying, like, I don't understand all this. And he goes, well, maybe you haven't tried hard enough. Maybe you have a hidden sin. And if that's not bad enough, we get over to chapter 8, where we see Bildad, and he basically says, and they say other things, I'm just summarizing, God would not allow the righteous to suffer. So what is that implying? Well, then, Job, you must not be righteous, because you're suffering. Do these things start to sound familiar to what we even hear today about people suffering, right? And it doesn't get any better. Now, the third friend, and Job, by the way, is interjecting things. Our third friend in chapter 11, basically, his thing, he agrees with them, but he also just kind of says, all right, just turn back to God then, Job. Obviously, you're going the wrong direction. Turn back to God. Turn around. He's kind of calling him out on repentance. And there's a time and place for that for sure. This was not the time and place for this. And it doesn't even stop there. They've all said something. And Job even says, as they're going throughout this, he's like, I'm trying and I'm not seeing what you're seeing. Again, I'm paraphrasing. I can't think of anything that I've done. I've been living life as best I can. I've been repenting as I go along. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not seeing this. Chapter 15, Eliphaz comes back in with it again. And he again says, were you actually listening to God, Job? Are you sure that you were listening? Really challenging. Like, are you sure that you were doing and listening to what he says? You have to have done something. You have to have done something. And then Bildad comes in and says, okay, as if it's not bad enough you have to have done something. He goes, well, this is just your punishment, the calamity for whatever it is you did, whether you know what it is or not. Right? This calamity is your punishment. And there are times, I want to say, that we do bring things upon ourselves. Absolutely. I've done this. I've done stuff. If you've done purposely wrong and you've suffered the consequences, you know that you brought that upon yourself. Job, again, is going, I cannot think of anything that would cause this. But they're not done. In chapter 20, Zophar comes back in and says, well, it's your pride that's caused this. Job rightly at one point says, wow, I wish I had better friends. Again, a paraphrase there. And he's like, y'all aren't helping the situation here, right? Because as he's looking for comfort, they're going, well, you must have done something wrong. This is a calamity you brought on yourself. It must be your pride. 22, we see Eliphaz again says, well, hey, accept God's instruction. You must have missed something. He just keeps coming around on his same thing. There's no way that you can be righteous because you're suffering. You had to miss something. He keeps harping on it, keeps hitting it. Bildad, this is the funniest line from this, basically resorts to name calling, you're a worm. Like, let's just face it, you're a worm, Job. Oh, okay. Well, we've gone from comforting now to name calling, basically. And then Zophar actually doesn't say anything else. So collectively, these three friends who started off so well are quite a disaster. And Job rightly is like, I don't want to hear from you guys anymore. He can't think of anything. He's trying to convince them. Can you imagine? There's probably nothing worse than losing all that stuff, your family, your health, and then having people blame you for all those things that happened to you. But it's not done. Because suddenly, again, keep in mind, God has not sent anything in here. These guys are going on. But suddenly we see this other guy, Eliahu, and this is in chapter 32, and he appears on the scene. It says, so these three men stopped answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. But Eliahu, who was a young man, he was very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. So it already tells us that he speaks up after these older men have gone. He even says, he starts off okay, though. He starts off, saying, at least looks humbly, I'm younger than everybody here, and I've been hearing what you guys have been saying, and I know that with age comes wisdom, but I have something to add to the table, and yada yada. So you think that maybe when you kind of are hearing this, other than you hear that he says he's very angry with Job, that maybe he's going to get it, but no. He goes on for 6 chapters and just reiterates what we just saw from all the other men. Why would God allow the righteous to suffer? Therefore, Job must not be righteous. All of this rehashed again. So you think you're like, oh, this guy might be on his side. He might get it. He might actually pay attention to what Job is saying. No, he doesn't. And this is where God finally speaks up. Right? This guy is going on and on and on, and God finally steps in. This is chapter 38. And it says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. Yeah, I don't know what kind of storm we're talking about. Well, we could be talking about a literal storm, but what Job has just been experiencing with his friends could be an emotional storm. And it's interesting because when God interjects and breaks his silence, he doesn't even directly address what these guys are even bringing up, right? He actually says, and I have a little diagram of some things, he's like, hey, so were you here when the earth's foundation were laid? Did you create the boundaries of the sea? How about the boundaries of the light, like the sun and the moon and how stuff working? Hey, do you know how snow comes out of the sky? Do you understand how snow and rain works? Like which drop where? Again, I'm paraphrasing. How about lions? Do you understand how lions work? How donkeys or hawks? He gives so many different things. Basically, all of creation. Do you understand any of these pieces? God breaks the silence to say, I'm the creator. I'm the one who made you. And that's it. You're like, okay, well, what about all these parts where these guys are accusing him and, saying Job's not righteous and whatever else and why he's suffering? And he goes through this entire thing, right? And then Job is actually silenced. Job's response is so short by comparison. And he says, this is in 42, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me, and my ears have heard you. But now my eyes have seen. Therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Basically, he's like, yeah, you are God, and that's good enough for me. He didn't ask the question that we tend to come back to God and say, well, why did you allow all this to happen? He goes, this is bigger than I can understand. A God who can create me, the earth, and do all these different things. Like, how am I going to comprehend how this works in this plan? And he says, you're God, and that's good enough for me. Now, granted, this also comes from a place of he already had a relationship with God before this. Throughout this entire time, he still has that relationship with God. And I think this is an important piece here as we're wrapping up, that silence did not mean that God wasn't with him. And in fact, there's 3 things that I really pulled out of Job when I came to looking over my notes. And one of them, of course, was God is light. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning. All the darkness that Job laments is not God. God's going to shine through. Satan is the one that is accusing and robbing and stealing, killing and destroying. If you're not sure, at the very beginning, that's exactly what it says when God says, okay, go and do it. It's not that God goes out and does it. Satan says, well, let me go do this. Not out for his best benefit. Real hope is found in God. And actually in Job 14:7, Job says this, at least there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and its new shoots will not fail. Now, he's lamenting that he feels like, lost and that he's in this darkness. But what he's also pointing out too is that even though a tree is cut down, if you just cut it out, that stump can regrow pieces. It's not going to regrow the exact same way that tree was, but things can grow off of that. He understands it, so that he understands the real hope is in God. And finally, what we were just talking about here, and this is what really had struck me, is that while God is quiet through these 35 chapters, that sometimes God is silent, but that doesn't mean that he's not there. And I think intellectually I've known that, but to see that in Job's story, I realized I was like, yeah, what is happening here? Why does God let these guys just run their mouths for how many chapters? But then I realized it doesn't mean that God wasn't there. It doesn't mean that he wasn't there paying attention. It doesn't mean he wasn't with Job this entire time, even though Job couldn't feel it or see it. And how much more for ourselves, right? Have you ever had those moments where you're like, God, where are you? Just you can't feel him doesn't mean that he's not there and that he's not with you. And the thing that really caught me here is this. After looking at Job's friends and sitting with him, I thought of this. Well, maybe when God is silent, maybe we should be too. The friends at the very beginning that were sitting with Job, they sat in silence. They may have talked a little bit when we talk about silence, but they certainly weren't accusing him. And maybe that's a lesson for us as well, that when God is silent, maybe we need to be too, because what's happening, I'm envisioning as I'm thinking about the story now, through those chapters that the friends are going on, God's listening. He hears it, he sees it, he knows it, and he knows how to respond because he's God, right? And it's a good reminder for us to be listening. When God is silent, maybe we need to be listening to what's going on and what God has for us. So as we're wrapping up today, I want us to think about this, that God's silences don't mean that you're left, that you're lost, that God doesn't care about you. God's silences may mean that God is listening and he's there and he is with you.